Fitzgerald, when he translated the work of Omar Khayyam in the middle of the 19th century, introduced a whole world of Persian ideas into English literature. Even Shakespeare and John Donne, the poet, some of their sonnets contained references to these Eastern poetic ideals and poetic ways of expressing themselves, which have lasted in our culture today.
The poets that are represented in these manuscripts date back to around the 10th, 11th century with Ferdowsi's great epic poem, the Shahnameh, or Book of Kings, through to the poets such as Nizami and Jami, Rumi Hafez. All of these will be represented in the manuscripts coming to us from the Bodleian Library.
Any visitor to Oxford is immediately captured by the romance of the buildings. There are the most gorgeous old colleges, and in the middle of it all is this extraordinary round building, which is a beautiful part of the Bodleian Library. The interesting thing is that when we built this library here in Melbourne, people had that idea. That's what a library was. It was like a temple. And so you have this extraordinary architecture. And what is very exciting about this exhibition is that you take one of the ancient seats of learning, Oxford, and you bring some part of their collection to Melbourne and you show it in a library that was built in that tradition and as part of that continuing thirst for knowledge and search for knowledge and storage of knowledge. And when you put those two things together, a Western tradition that was brought to Australia as part of our culture, with an Eastern tradition that was captured and taken to Oxford as part of a scholarly culture, you get another intersection between these two great libraries. It's a fabulous moment because we can take two traditions and weave them together around this idea of love.
These peoples, these civilizations, created some of the most beautiful and long-lasting works of literature and art that the world has ever seen. And these works also had a dialogue with the West. These ideas were transmitted through the manuscripts that were collected and brought to places like the Bodleian Library to whole new generations of writers and artists who became passionate devotees of Persian art and culture. And I think these books should be seen as cultural ambassadors.
The Shahnameh is always going to be important. I think it's important as a work of world literature, even outside Iran. People should be reading this for its message and for the power of the stories. But for Persians themselves, of course, it's always going to be important as there's reference to their past. It's their Shakespeare, it's their Chaucer, it's their main expression of their poetry and their characters, the actions that are reflected in their history. And I think it's always going to be of vital importance to them.
They have to really go to the soul of Persians. And the soul of Persians, as I understand it, really is embedded in the poetry of these great poets that the West all lived, particularly Omar Khayyam, Hafiz, Sa'di, and specifically Rumi. So if you want to know your soul, you have to read these greats.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Do you hear me? Now you hear me? Okay, great. You still don't? Okay, it's better now. Thank you very much for taking the day on such a beautiful day, beautiful fall day, to come and listen to me. I'm sure you didn't come to listen to me, but to listen to our speaker. My name is Ahmed Karimi Hakak, and I'm Director of Shan Center for Persian Studies, and I'm delighted that you are here. welcome you and welcome you to not just this event, but every event we're having this year and the years to come. It is through your participation that we make our presence known beyond our campus, and that's a vital part of our mission, the mission of a university center with outreach as one of its aspects of its mission. As you know, this is the concluding lecture in the third Ihsani Arshater lecture series, this year featuring Professor Priscilla Soucek, Professor of Art History at New York University. We are delighted and honored to have her, and I'll introduce her in a minute, and she will begin her lecture. But before I do that, let me tell you that the previous speakers in the series were Professor Ali Ben Mazizi of Boston College in 2007, and Professor Ebran Abrahamian, Professor of Iranian History at Baruch College of the City University of New York in 2009. The committee that selects the speaker for every other year listens to your feedback, your input. So if you think there's a professor of prominence with a defined field writing a book on a topic that we should need to know about before the book is published, please alert us to it, and we'll be happy to contact them and have them be our guests for the next lecture series. As you see, these lecture series really, as I said in the interview that Mr. Mukhtar of the Washington Iranians had with me, they really run fresh blood in the veins of a university. In the week that Dr. Soucek has been here, I have heard so many genuine expressions of interest in Iranian art history, which is a very important tradition among the various traditions of art history. And in fact, we have an art history graduate student. Is Ms. Lambert here? She will be shortly. Who Priscilla has requested to see you and chat with you, pick your brain maybe a little bit after the talk today. I would like to also express my delight and extreme privilege in being able to have the person whose name is on these lecture series, Professor Ihsani Arshater, with us here. So please join me in welcoming Professor Arshater is flanked by Dr. Jalal Matini, former president of the Ferdowsi University of Mashhad and editor for many decades of Iran Shenasi and an authority on Persian literature that all of us need to consult from time to time. And we appreciate your presence here, Dr. Matini. And of course, my dear friend, Ms. Mahnaz Afkhami and Dr. Gholam Reza Afkhami. Mahnaz, of course, the president of Women's Learning Partnership and executive director of the Foundation for Iranian Studies, and their services are very, very well known to this community, particularly in and around Washington, D.C. I also take special delight in introducing to you, since we are talking about books and the art of the book and art history in the book, etc., those individuals who, through the past 8 years that the center has been here, have made significant and substantive donations to our book holdings. As you know, a university is supposed to reflect in its library the curriculum. Before there was a Center for Persian Studies at this university, there was not much library holdings in Persian studies, be it Persian literature or political science or history or whatever. Since we have been here, we have been fortunate to have had many, many donations, the most significant ones of which, and I'll name only three, the late Mr. Gudarzi, his wife, Dr. Rahel Rezai, donated his books to our center. The next major donation came from Dr. Haleh Isfandiari and her husband, Dr. Shaul Bakhash, who must be known to you because they both participated in our conferences and gatherings as well. And the person we're honored to have among us today, Dr. Habib Lajevardi, who gave his lifelong collection of books to and microfilms and so many other periodicals and various titles, some of which cannot be found anywhere, to our library, and we really are honored to have your collection. So right now, I get reports from the people at McKeldin Library and other libraries at this university that this university is getting to be a point of borrowing for Iranian studies books rather than always on the borrowing side itself. And you can see how important that is and how valuable such contributions can be to a center like ours. And last but not least, I would like to mention a surprise guest we have among us, Ustad Israfil Shirchi. Please stand up and be recognized. The most prominent name in Iranian art of the book, a living legend in calligraphy, and an heir to those artists of old that have given us the beautiful books that Dr. Soucek will be speaking about. As far as the Roshan Center itself is concerned, we have been beneficiaries of various endowments, of which the Ehsan Yar Shaker Endowment for Biennial Lecture Series is one. The most substantive in material terms of these contributions came from Dr. Elahe Mirjalali, president of the Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute, once based in San Francisco, they're in Washington, D.C. now, in Honolulu, Hawaii, but with a presence on the internet. And of course, Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute has started various giving projects in other universities too, just as the Iran Heritage Foundation or Persian Heritage Foundation of New York has given lecture series to other universities as well, including Harvard, the UCLA, and Oxford, and we are the fourth university and beneficiary of the lecture series. Dr. Mirjalali's institute, Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute, has made contributions to other universities, but they have made by far the largest contribution of $3 million to our center, and with that, we are supposed to get an advanced professor of Iranian studies in one field of Iranian studies, and we are right now searching for the second time for one. All of those endowments, those donations are immensely important to us. Early on in the history of the center, Mr. Mahmoud Khayyami came forward with a substantive donation. Mr. Amir Saleh, of course, was an early donor to our causes. Our old colleague of this college, this School of Business, Dr. Arjang Asad, who would have loved to be with us, but unfortunately could not be here because he has other engagement in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, started the donation in the name of his mother. Dr. Sirus Amir Mokri, now Assistant Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, has been an early and continuous contributor to our center. Mr. Fred Farshe, Dr. Qahari, the Parsa Foundation, all of these donations make our activities possible. And beyond and besides the historical commitment that the university has made to offices and professors, tenure track professors and such are extremely important. Mr. Jamshid Ansari, Mr. and Mrs. Hadabi and Alawi, Mr. Khosrow Semnani, and one more who is among us, and that's Dr. Mirdad Masumi and his wife Eileen, have made substantial contributions to our center. And we thank you all. I'm sure there are names that I cannot remember right now, so forgive me and accept this partial list from me for now. Before introducing the speaker, let me also mention my particular pride in a student of ours, John Benson. Jake is, as of today, Jake, correct? Is now the curator select of the Islamic Manuscripts Project at the Darul Kutub in the National what's this? Library of Egypt, right? And you'll be going to Cairo. We'll send you a degree there. Congratulations. Over over the past week, we have delighted our minds and feasted our eyes on the words and images that Dr. Priscilla Soucek has been kind enough to share with us. Indeed, it's an eye-opener. Whether you know nothing about Iranian culture or everything about it, these have got to come to you as a surprise. The rarity of the images that she has cast in these lecture series. Imagine a puzzle in pictures. I didn't know one existed, but she has indeed shown us that people must have been solving puzzles all over the world, including in Iranian culture for millennia, and still have puzzles to solve as we go from the news today, correct? It's amazing to see an image with the Prophet and his family, including grandsons Hassan and Hussein as children, his daughter Fatima and his son-in-law and cousin Ali next to him, holding a debate with the infidel or the non-believers, in which someone has seen fit to deface the non-believers, the unbelievers, and it's wonderful mix of image, ideology, and all sorts of ways of casting these images. And she has moved us gradually from the 13th century, early 13th century, when early 13th century when Genghis Khan invades Iran and lays waste to much of it, especially in the north, to a century and a half later when Tamerlane comes forth, and perhaps not with that intensely destructive force, but still establishes himself in that plateau. And then his sons and grandchildren are civilized and start the schools of Herat and Tabriz and Shiraz and elsewhere in the arts of the book. And the books that we have really speak volumes of the artistry, the craftsmanship, the creativity that has gone into these works. And I, for one, have every time listened to one of Professor Soucek's lectures, have gone home and have once again looked at the images, and I see myself gaining some critical reading in image analysis. And I want to thank you, Priscilla, for all of that. Professor Priscilla Soucek is, as I mentioned, Professor of Artistry at NYU. She comes from a very illustrious background: American University of Beirut, University of Wisconsin, University of Michigan, and eventually since 1981 at the University of New York University, and also Deputy Director of Islamic Collections at Metropolitan Museum of Art in Manhattan. She has written extensively and deeply on the arts of the book, and today she concludes her lecture series with what I'm sure will be a culminating lecture of historical proportions. We can't wait to see your book out, Priscilla. Thank you very much for honoring us by accepting our invitation. The floor is yours, please.
There'll be a technical pause while we get the mic fixed up. You turned it off?
No, it's off actually.
Yeah, that's all right. So do you want it this side or that side, or do you care?
I think that's okay.
This is okay.
Yeah, this is better.
You think the other side's better? Okay. So now we can turn it on?
Yeah, it's on.
Is the light, yeah, it's current. There it is. I hope the light level is not too bad for the audience. Can you see the images?
Yes.
I can't from where I am. It said this is obviously not designed for someone who wants to see what they're doing. All right. Do we have the image? There we go. So we're off to the races, as they say. So this afternoon, this is the final of 4 lectures for this week. And the idea that I had for this one was really kind of not very elaborate, I guess, to gather together pictures that I thought were particularly interesting for some reason. that were not just an illustration of a story, but somehow that they were trying to push the boundaries of the medium and to develop new skills and to just test things out. And one of the things I have been thinking about as I've been working on these lectures is that for our eyes, the images are very stylized and have a kind of a way of being put together, which makes them look quite distant in a way. But as I've tried to kind of get into the understanding of what was behind the images, I've come to the realization that every once in a while, and you can't really tell which it's going to be, every once in a while there's a picture which probably reflects something in the life of the person who made it. And this was actually an idea that had never occurred to me. These seem so kind of stylized and formulaic on some level, kind of set in a pattern, but the idea that people would have been looking around them and making a picture based on what they saw actually really only occurred to me as I was going through this process. And there are not many of them, but they're here scattered through my lecture. You will come to them. Now, today's lecture is not really intended to be historical, although in the beginning I will start with the 13th century. And I'll kind of go back and forth, and I'll try to tell you what period we're in when I arrive, but it's not really the date that's the issue. The issue is really, what are the painters telling us, showing us? How do we understand the story that they present? And the thing about it that is also, I was somewhat taken surprised by, was that a lot of the images, in fact, are very emotional. They convey a message. Now, they look so kind of distant that it's hard to believe that there's really a passion behind it. But as you will see, I think this is really the case. So in the past week, I've been sharing my opinions about the luxury book and its role in Iranian art and culture. And I really enjoyed my time on this beautiful campus. Today, I'm trying to talk about paintings, individual paintings, of particular interest, where the painter produced a work that I find really compelling. So it's not strictly historical, but rather by topics. And one of my themes will be the way painters worked to convey emotion. There was no single method for doing this. And in fact, there are very few aspects of these pictures which are true of all examples. So they're kind of exceptions, a whole lecture of exceptions. So among the examples I show you, they're mostly small. The images themselves, however, transcend, I think, that space and time and invite us to another location. It is totally impossible to estimate the original cost of the books that we will look in pictures. At this point, I think we just call them priceless. Now, there are many ways to appreciate these pictures. And this was the image that we selected for the sort of cover. I think here we see a beautiful young man offering a book to someone that we don't see. So these books were appreciated, shared, enjoyed, and I think we should do the same. And so the simplest thing is to just look at them and find them beautiful. But as I hope you'll see, that there are more to it than that as we get through the images. The place I chose to start is, in fact, the place where we seem to have the beginning of the story altogether. It's a manuscript where we see the signature of the painter, and it's a manuscript that actually comes from 13th century Anatolia. And here he is, signing his name, Abdülmu'min of Khoy, with around the figures who are the main protagonists of the story, a pair of lovers named Varka and Gulsha. Now, this is a unique manuscript of a text which was composed in the Ghaznavid period in Afghanistan, and its only surviving copy comes from Anatolia. The pictures are, here we see the lovers and sort of beginning of the story, and the thing that's so fascinating about this manuscript is not just that it's unique, but that it uses a very unusual method of conveying emotion. And this method was actually was discovered by a scholar by the name of Abbas Danishvari, who is probably known to many of you in the room. And what he realized from studying this manuscript was that this painter, who's this Abdul Mu'min, used Persian proverbs as a resource in trying to explain the story. Here, for example, we have the story of Varka and Gulsha is a kind of story you're probably all familiar with, where you have a couple of children who fall in love, and then their parents try to keep them apart, and the whole thing gets very complicated, and there are battles, and everything it goes on, and there's adventure after adventure, and eventually they die and are buried in the same place and are resurrected in paradise. So it's a kind of pattern of a love story. It was similar to Layli and Majnun, of which there are some others as well. So the pattern was sort of set. But here we see the father of one of the boy. His name. If somebody came along and wrote his name over his head for us. And so the father is in the process of deceiving his son, because the parents don't want the couple to get together, so the parents keep making trouble. So, but this idea that the father is deceiving the son is conveyed by the cat with a mouse. And the cat with the mouse, which we see on the side, is the sort of parallel to the human action which is going on in front of us. It tells us the father is telling his son a lie, the father is causing trouble, and so this method of communicating by an animal was something I had never seen before. I also want to draw your attention to the strange plant on the other side, which grows feet, hands, and even a face. I've never seen anything quite like it, and I don't really know. Abbas Danishvari had no explanation for it. Perhaps one of you have an idea. Now, stories like this need a kind of facilitator, and in this case, the facilitator was someone called Shah Isham. You see him in the middle, and he's obviously a kind of Turk of some sort, and he has Varka and Gulsha. He marries Gulsha, the girl, but he's very gentlemanly about it. He doesn't really force her to do anything she doesn't want to, and so she continues to pine for Varka. Here he brings them together momentarily, but they all know that they cannot stay together. So Varka goes off to the Yemen, and Gulsha stays with her husband. Now there's an enormous number of plots and subplots, but here's another case where the animal comes into the picture. Here the dog also shows up in these stories, as these pictures, as something not really completely trustworthy. And so here we understand by the fact the dog is chewing on a boot that trouble is in store. And it is a story where a young woman is sending a ring to Varka and so forth. These stories need kind of intermediaries who kind of go between the main parties. So, but it's the dog I think is quite compelling. And here again comes back the cat. In this case, it's the mother of Gulsha who's deceiving her, and she's telling her lies about where Varka is or isn't. And Gulsha is, of course, completely overcome with despair. And the cats on the other side are warning us, do not believe what the mother is saying. Now, the final one I'm going to show you is another animal, which this is our heroine who has utterly collapsed. These stories, they go back and forth, and quite often the heroine faints and is unconscious for a period of time. So here she is weeping, moaning, and being miserable by herself in her tent. And you can see her braids are kind of all wound around her arm in a very elegant way, all tangled up the way her emotions are tangled with her lovers. But here the animal who's really part of the story is the rabbit, who's sort of jumping off, or hare rather, jumping out of the picture. And Abbas Danishvari identifies this as the rabbit of good fortune who's deserting her. So we know that she's miserable, and she's going to stay miserable because the rabbit of good fortune has deserted her. Now, beyond it's quite a delightful rabbit also, don't you think? He's quite sweet. So the animals really, I've never seen a story where the animals play this kind of active role, and I thought it was quite fascinating. Now, another thing which I discovered about Varka and Gulsha set up off in a slightly different direction. This is, of course, the 13th century is the period of the Crusades in the Near East, and the many, many battles, of course, in Varka and Gulsha between various tribes and so forth. But this one I thought was really quite extraordinary because, first of all, of course, you have a certain number of camels, which corresponds to the Arabian theme, but there's a person on a caparisoned horse, a horse with a great suit of armor, a kind of horse armor down to the ground. You see him. And in front of him is a most curious-looking person who's got sort of a profile face. He's wearing unusual leggings. He's carrying a spear. He really doesn't look like anybody else in the entire manuscript. And so I got to wondering who he was and what he was doing in the middle of 13th century Anatolia. And after I looked around a bit, I decided that he was in fact a crusader foot soldier. You hear about the Crusader knights, but of course most of the crusading armies were footmen who were hired as mercenaries by the various armies. And how he got into Varka and Gulsha, I don't quite know, but he must have been in Anatolia. And Abdul-Mumin had seen him and decided to include him in the story. So here's a case where the story, which is set in a sort of distant Arabia, involving this kind of mythic lovers whose story was written in Afghanistan, illustrated in Anatolia, all of a sudden we find a picture which actually connects us to the time and place in which the manuscript was produced. So that's this kind of sudden coup that you find in these pictures, that all of a sudden something pops up which is really out of the immediate foreground of the picture. Now, another of the most famous manuscripts in the United States is a manuscript called the Manafil Hayawan, the Usefulness of Animals, which is in the Pierpont Morgan Library. Mr. Pierpont Morgan bought it for his collection. It's one of his own personal books. I don't know what he thought of it, but he had quite wide-ranging taste. Here is the manuscript has been very well studied, and you see here it has sort of two kinds of paintings. This is the sort of more conservative style, where you have a pair of lions with a kind of backdrop of vegetation. This is a sort of traditional 13th century kind of painting. Then, of course, there's the more Chinese-looking pictures, which were added by a different painter, also in the late 13th century. So that's what most people have focused on, the difference between these sort of Near Eastern pictures and these Far Eastern pictures. But there's one picture at the very beginning of the manuscript. It's actually the first picture, which no one has ever figured out. And so I decided for this lecture that I would use the occasion, to really kind of figure out what in the world this is a picture of. Now, as you can see, and if you wanted to read the text, what you have here is a man and a woman standing side by side. However, there's something really quite peculiar about these people. First of all, if you think of the medieval Islamic world and the way people dressed and covered themselves, these people are decidedly not very covered, and they're wearing or carrying something which is really very puzzling. When I first looked at it, it looked rather like a beach towel or something of that sort. But of course, we know they weren't headed to the beach. The manuscript was made in Maraghe. Although Lake Urmia is not far away, I'm sure beach going was not on the agenda in 13th century Iran. So some other explanation has to be found. So I looked at this picture, and I have been actually puzzled about it for a long time. So I have been thinking about what in the world it could mean. Why is it here, and where did it come from? So I had a hunch of which way to turn, and the thing that set me in that direction was the fact that they're wearing so little, that their bodies, although they're not anatomically very specific, are clearly, naked, male and female, and this is not something that the Islamic world really does very much in the public arena. So there had to be another force at work. Now, I had a suspicion that it was classical. I had a suspicion that it was somehow Greek or Roman, because the Greeks and the Romans were quite delighted by the naked human body, and you know they reproduced it. And the other thing which also set me in that direction was the hair of our gentlemen, which is really quite, luxuriant and thick, because this god or semi-god Dionysus was noted for his luxuriant hair. Of course, this is a Greek medallion, gold medallion. He has grapes growing through his hair, which our gentleman does not. But still, I thought this looked rather promising as an avenue. And here we get even a little bit better, because here's not exactly the combination of clothing that they are wearing, but it resembled it. It's a piece of cloth draped around the body, which in the last analysis is what these people have too. It's just slightly arranged more modestly. But so I thought, again, Dionysus was not a bad start for a kind of, possible prototype of our picture. But of course there were many questions remaining. Why would Dionysus show up in the 13th century Iran, and how in the world would he have been known to them? Not a statue, very little classical sculpture has ever been discovered in the area of Iran. Oh, there are a few pieces, but I think the chances of there having been classical sculpture in Maraghe in 1297 are just about zero. So that wasn't the way. Now, the other thing is that there are two of them, two figures, and I began to look at Dionysiac representations in various medium. Here's a floor mosaic, and you can see that they do come in pairs, and also that they're sort of dancing or otherwise sort of leaning. The man has they have lots of hair, also a spear. So I felt like I was getting closer to a possible source. And here's another one that says male and female, which is what we have here. Also drapery, dancing, hair. It was beginning to look like this was the right direction. But clearly these are not the kind of things that anybody in Maraghe in the 13th century could ever have seen. So I was still back to that question. What was the source, and why was this picture, if it was Dionysus somehow, what was he doing in Manafi al-Hayawan? But I did remember that in Iran, in the Sasanian period, we do know that the cult of Dionysus was actually quite widespread. This is the excavated plan of excavated palace near Bishapur, and there are two, as you can see, two mosaic series of rooms in the floors. Only the floor survives, and one of them, which you see number 2, has Dionysiac themes in the mosaics. So this palace at Bishapur, which is from the early Sasanian period, probably even built by Roman prisoners of war, was showing us that the cult of Dionysus was celebrated at that point in Iran. And we actually, so that began to look more promising, but still, we have to have a source. And it can't be the mosaics, it couldn't have been the other things. We need to get closer to what was really at work. So I looked around some more, and I discovered that there are a lot of objects with Dionysus on them. This is Byzantine, and you can see the people are dancing, they're cavorting. And of course, Dionysus is the god of wine and celebration, and people drank and listened to music, and it was, here's another dancing, music, celebration theme on a silver platter. So I think that the painting in the Morgan is modeled after something like this, a silver object with two people on it, not exactly these two people, but something very similar that recalls the theme of Dionysiac celebrations. And so was it really plausible that that sort of thing could have been found in Iran? Well, we have in the Metropolitan Museum, after all, this plate, which is a Sasanian silver plate of a Dionysiac procession. It's not the same Dionysiac procession, but you can see there's a little lion sort of drinking wine down below. There are people with drinking cups. There's a certain people with really very little on. and many of the features that we have in our composition, not exactly the same elements and not exactly the same design, but the same general idea. So I feel quite confident that somehow in Maraghe they found something. Sorry, I'm going the wrong direction here. They found something by accident, and they used it as a model for the painting. Now, Ghazan Khan is the person for whom the manuscript was made, and if anything had been found in the territory of the Mongol Empire, it would have probably been brought to the attention of the Mongols themselves. So probably Ghazan Khan had a Sasanian or Byzantine silver plate, and he turned it over to the painter and said, all right, make a picture based on that. At least that's my theory at the moment. Now, in addition, another sort of great feature, I think, a great strength of Iranian manuscripts is the fact that there are so many stories that involve animals. And of course, the whole long tradition of Kalila and Dimna, as it's often called, in many permutations and translations, is one of the major, is one of the reasons why these sorts of pictures are so popular. And there are of course, many copies of Kalila and Dimna. They're different authors. It's a very complicated project. But one of the most wonderful series of pictures has no text at all. It was cut out, the pictures were cut out of the text and pasted into a sort of album. And they're in Istanbul. Now, we think these are coming from the late 14th century. We don't know exactly where in Iran, and since there's no text at all virtually left, we have only the pictures themselves. But people have identified them, and so we sort of know what the stories are. And there's a couple sequences here which I thought were so charming that I wanted to share them with you. One of the things which I find so interesting about Kalila and Dimna is the way the painters managed to put human traits in animal form. We're not really talking about animals as animals, I think, but animals as sort of surrogate for human characteristics. So you have the jackal, who personifies cunning, deceit, the willingness to manipulate people. He's a rather negative character. And he has victims of various sorts who are gullible, simple, easily deceived, such as this donkey. And so I think you can see, even on the expression that the artist has put on their faces, that these two personalities, we have the conniving jackal and the credulous donkey. Now, the donkey is being told by the jackal that there's a pasture. Look at where you are. You're surrounded by rocks. You have nothing to eat. But there's a pasture which is so delicious. You must go. You must find it. You must enjoy this wonderful grass. So the jackal gets on the back of the donkey. You see him here? He's on the back of the donkey. He takes the donkey by the ear, and he keeps whispering in his ear, remember that grass. It's so green. It's so delicious. It's so luscious. And the donkey is mesmerized. You can see he's got his eyes closed. He's already tasting that delicious grass. And so he's speeding along, trying to get there as quickly as possible. But of course, we know that what he's going to find when he gets there is not grass, but the lion who will have him for dinner. So we understand. So I think the kind of depiction of the animal is so kind of sensitive and really compelling. Kalila and Dimna is also full of other stories which have to do with people, or people and demons and so forth. And here's one which I think is really one of the best. You can see the participants here. It's called The Story of the Ascetic, the Thief, and the Demon. Now, you can pick out the demon, I'm pretty sure. He's the one with the horns. He's the horns and the ears, the sort of bovine face. The Iranian sort of way of representing a demon is very curious, and I've never seen anybody quite explain it, but there's a kind of cow-like face. But then we have really, he's a biped. He looks human almost, but he carries this very curious weapon, which is a hoof. Now the other person is just a thief, an ordinary thief. And the two of them stumbled upon an ascetic, when you see up above, who had just been given a cow. One of his admirers gave him a cow to take home to have milk. So the ascetic was taking his cow home when the thief and the demon saw him on the road and decided to tag along. And as they walked toward the ascetic's house, they sort of, residence, they sort of talked to each other, and the demon said, "Who are you?" to the thief. And the thief said, "I'm a thief, and I'm after the cow." "Who are you?" The demon said, "I'm a demon, and I want to kill a man." So they decided that probably they could work together on this project and help each other out. So here they are. The ascetic has gone to bed. The cow is munching away. And now the demon and the thief have got to figure out what to do. But I think if you look at their feet, you'll see that they're already quarreling. See the way the feet are placed? You can see the rocking back and forth, and their arms and body language, they are going at it. Because each of them began to think, wait a minute, the thief thought, if the demon kills the man, it's going to be such an uproar, I'll never get the cow. And the demons thought, if this man takes the cow, it's going to be a ruckus, the neighbors will come, I'll never be able to kill the man. So they began to get angrier and angrier at each other. And you can see this kind of, the tension is building here as they stand. And the ascetic is still asleep, the cow is still eating, but things are getting really tense. So finally they can't stand it anymore. And the demon shouts, "Watch out! Somebody's trying to steal your cow." And the thief shouts, "Look out! Wake up! Somebody's trying to kill you." And of course, what happens is that the neighbors come, the thief and the demon lose their opportunity, and the whole thing comes to naught. But I think the humor of that illustration is really quite delightful. Here you see the next episode, which is after the neighbors have rushed in, and the ascetic is now awake, and the thief and the demon are going off on their separate ways. This is a different manuscript, but the final episode of the story. The only thing that's a little awkward about this picture is that by the time the painter got everybody in that he needed, there wasn't much space for the cow. So the cow is kind of like a cat, sort of down in the front. But we get the idea. The cow is, after all, there. So I think Kalila and Dimna has such a range of stories in it that there's really something to fit every occasion. One of the kinds of stories which I find very interesting in this manuscript and in this collections of fables, which is a very interesting question, really, is the problem of illusion. And here it's the illusion of a reflection. So this is a story which is where we have the kind of opposite combination of the donkey and the jackal, where we have a hare who manages to persuade a stupid lion to do something. So we have, this is the way it would have been before in the 13th century, the kind of abstract landscape. Everything is a symbol. We have the little hare sort of sitting up on top. We have the lion on the other side, and you can see their reflections sort of crisscrossing in the center of the picture. But of course the water is also just like rocks. I mean, it's not really very water-like. The painter didn't really know what to do to create the surface of a water and a reflection. So we have we have all the pieces of the story, but to understand it, you have to sit and sort of think it through and put it together in your head. Now, as the painters in Iran became more adept at landscape, they began to be able to do this sort of thing much more accomplished way. So, for example, the picture on the left from the late 14th century It's the same two characters, but now the hair is sort of in between the legs of the lion, and you really see him best in the reflection, which is down below. But of course, the painter had a problem, because when the lion looks down into the water and sees his reflection, of course, we can't see what he sees because our perspective is wrong. So he kind of cut a hole in the rocks so we can sort of see under the rock so we see what the lion sees in our own sort of space. And you can see the hair very neatly between the legs of the lion. I think the hair is actually very clear. The lion is a little sort of fuzzy, and I think that sort of indicates that the hair is really the one who is in fact in charge in this project. And so the hair persuades the lion that reflection is another lion, and that lion is trying to get his territory, and that if he wants to do something about it, he has to get in there and get it. So the lion, gullible lion, jumps into the pit and drowns. And now we see in the final episode the hare looking down into the pit, and we see the lion just dead in the water. It's fascinating. See, really, he looks quite dead, and it's quite sort of well taken. His mouth is open, his body is limp, and again, we see a cutaway in order to see into it. But I think there's a kind of real sense of the experience of seeing a reflection, of seeing something in water. The artist was really working from his own observation. Now, another kind of story in Kalila and Dimna. This is a case again involving people, where it's perhaps the 13th century or 14th century kind of equivalent of how to deal with medical malpractice, because what's happened here is that the gentleman in green is a physician, and he has given the daughter of the king medicine which killed her. You can see she's recumbent on that, and the king, her father, is completely distraught. So what does he do? He says, all right, take your own medicine. So the doctor has to swallow the medicine he gave the daughter that killed her, and what we see is he's just drunk it, and he's just about to collapse. You can see he's sort of teetering on the edge, and his eyes are closed, and in another minute he'll be gone. So the painter really gives us a kind of very tiny moment, the key moment in the story where the father has his revenge, although of course the daughter is still dead. Now we understand who is alive and who is dead, who is dying, and we understand all this because we know the story. But as time went on, the painters in Iran got more sort of subtle tools for communicating this kind of question. And I found, for example, this picture from the early 17th century. There is no ambiguity anymore. The corpse is definitely a corpse. You can see the body. It looks very dead. It's wrapped in a shroud. And this is a night scene. Now, the painting does have a few colors in it, but I like the black and white version because I think this is a painter who works with dark and light. He works with the impact of light, and he works with shadows and reflections, and you can see smoke coming up from the various incense burners, the flames flickering of the candles, and more specifically, of course, we see Shireen committing suicide on her husband's corpse. And it is really a suicide that feels very real. You could almost see, you see the blood spurting out, you feel the kind of corporeality of her body. This is a much more kind of almost photographic representation of an incident from the 17th century. It looks almost like a photograph. So by the 17th century, there were painters who were experimenting with light and darkness, with color and texture, who could really communicate a scene like this with this kind of visceral immediacy. Now, this is another picture by the same painter, and it's also somewhat colored, but again, the subject is one where darkness is really at issue, because it's Alexander the Iskandar's search for the land, entering into the land of darkness. You know, his long wanderings over the world. He goes to all kinds of areas, and he passes through this kind of area which they describe as a kind of land of darkness, which is normally not depicted. But here the painter, because he had this kind of capacity to give us light and dark, shadow and flame, was able to take on this subject and to give us a picture of it. Now, down in the foreground, we see some very curious features, and I think that this is probably partly copied from a print, partly copied from a Dutch or Flemish print, which was known to the painter, and probably some of his other skills of working with light, working with shadow, working with smoke, that these are kind of techniques which he learned by studying European prints. European prints circulated throughout the Near East and India in the 17th century in great numbers. I don't know exactly what he was looking at, and I actually, it's something I hope to look into. What kind of sources were at his disposal? What did he see that made him learn how to do these things? So that's something I want to look into after I go back to New York. Now, it's not all, this period of 17th century, the mid-17th century in Iran, is really particularly associated. We finally have a person by the name of Muhammad Zaman, whose signature is on the tambourine in the picture on the side. You can see there's an inscription on the tambourine that the people are holding up. This is a night scene, so it's very similar to what we saw before. That one scene in daylight, one scene at night. These are pages illustrating stories from the Hafbekar, which have been added to a manuscript in the British Library that was made for Shah Tahmasp. So it's a 16th century manuscript.